Good day, learners. Welcome to our history discussion. Specifically, we are focusing on the extension of Cold War. And I understand for our grade 12 learners, we are going to focus on our case study of the extension of Cold War, which is question number 4 in our paper 1 examination, which is the case study for the Vietnam War. Right. Basically, the Vietnam War, we are looking at the extension of Cold War into other parts of the world. We understand the origins of Cold War. When we're talking of the origins of Cold War, we are looking at how the Cold War tensions came to exist in Europe, mainly because of the differences in ideology of capitalism and communism, which ended up dividing the world into two hostile camps, which were basically the Western part, which was a pro-capitalist world, and the Eastern world, which was a pro-communist world. And we understand from the perspective of capitalism, we had America, the USA, which was a key player in spreading capitalism across the globe. And on the extreme East, we understand there was the USSR, which is Russia, and its allies from the East, who were also advocating for the spread of communist ideologies across the world. That was the origins of Cold War tensions, America being backed up by Britain and France, while the USA being backed up by China and other Eastern Bloc countries in support of communism. Right. So those tensions, they ended up spreading in other parts of the world. And here we are looking at Vietnam, which is a Southeastern Asia country, where there was a war which actually erupted from the tensions that had started in Europe, the tensions which had started from ideological differences between capitalism and communism. Right, we want to go into the details of the Vietnam War. Right, and we are going to use a sample question. We will be making reference to the question. The question is just a short phrased question, which says, all the military might of a superpower could not defeat a small nation of peasants. That is our historical statement. All the military might of a superpower could not defeat a small nation of peasants. We are looking at a superpower in the form of the USA, and the USA failing to defeat a small nation of peasants. Right. So basically, we are looking at a superpower, which is the USA, and failing to defeat a small nation of peasant farmers. And basically, we are referring to the Viet Cong. Right. That's the situation that we have in mind. We're having a superpower with all military might. The USA is a giant, it's a superpower, but however, it failed to defeat a very small nation of peasants in that war. What was the reason for America failing to defeat? So, if we check back to our question, the question says, do you agree with the above statement? Use relevant examples to support your answer. That is the guideline to our essay question. Are we suggesting that it's true that a superpower failed to defeat a small nation of peasants? Definitely, it is agreeable because we know the result. America, the USA, lost the war. The war results came in favor of the Viet Cong. So USA lost the war. So there's no way we can disagree. We have to agree. That is in agreement. So what you need to do when you're answering this question, I will start by highlighting the key aspects of answering the question. We are looking at the question which says, do you agree? So in your introduction, basically your introduction must address the three requirements or the three steps of an introduction. The first one is an answer to the question. When you are answering the question, we are taking a stance to the question, or we are taking a line of argument. So in this essay here, there's no definite way we can not agree with that statement. It is agreeable. One can agree with that statement because we know the results of the war came in favor of the Viet Cong, and the Americans are lost at that particular Vietnam War. Right. Then after you have answered the question, then the next thing that is required in the introduction is for you to give reasons. Why? Why are you answering the question in that direction? Why are you agreeing to the statement? Why did you take that stance in that argument? Why did you choose to take the line of argument of agreement to the statement? You give general reasons. The reason being that America lost in the war, though it was using conventional strategies with all those forms of fighting equipment and fighting techniques. America still lost the war. The small nation of peasants was able to effectively institute the guerrilla warfare and was able to win the war against the mighty superpower. We are giving general reasons. We are giving insights as to why we have chosen to take that direction of argument, why we have chosen to argue in that direction that Americans, despite their mighty military power, they lost a war to a small nation of peasants. Then after you give your reasons, then there is need for an elaboration here. You must therefore elaborate or give orientation. What are we saying on this step here? We are saying you must therefore show the reader the direction or what historical evidence is going to be presented in the essay. You are giving the reader an elaboration. This essay is going to further elaborate on the American tactics that they employed in the Vietnam War against the Vietnamese guerrillas, leading to their failure to defeat a small nation of peasants. That's an elaboration. You are giving orientation to the reader what they should expect in the essay. Then with those 3 steps in your introduction, rather I am certain your introduction will be complete. It will be addressing the basics of the requirements of an introduction. It has an answer to the question and a direct answer to the question for that matter. Do you agree? Show whether you're in agreement or you're in a disagreement. Why are you in agreement? You give the general reasons why you agreed to that statement. And then you give an elaboration or an orientation to the reader of what they should expect in the presentation. What historical evidence are you going to use in this presentation? What are you going to talk about? What is the direction of the essay? Then the introduction is contextualized, is properly contextualized, is answering the question, is addressing the basics of an introduction of a history essay. Right. So what I'm going to do here, I am going to be using the content in this presentation to explain so that maybe I fully equip you with the skills of writing the essay at the same time with the content required in explaining and creating full paragraphs. Right, let's look at the overview of the Cold War in Vietnam. Right, we are looking at 1957 to 1965. There was struggle in Vietnam between the South Vietnamese army and the communist-trained rebels known as the Viet Cong. We are going to look at how the Viet Cong got to establish themselves. Then 1965-1969, we're looking at the North Vietnamese and USA struggle, including the nature of the Vietnamese war against the USA. That's the period of the war. Then the war from a Vietnamese and the US perspective. How did the Vietnamese perceive the war? And how did the US perceive the war? We have different perceptions there between those two groups. Then the war as a global issue. How did it affect international affairs? How was it a global concern that America, after it was involved in so many scandals, again had the power to get involved in Vietnam? How did it affect the image of the USA on a global scale, given the atrocities that it had committed in the war? And also given the budget constraints that it had put on its own budget, and also given the loss of lives of Americans, the young Americans who were sent to war. How was it a global issue across the whole world? Then we also have to look at The 1969 to 1975, America's withdrawal from Vietnam, what we call Vietnamization, and also the impact of USA politics and student movements. Right, that is how we're going to break down our discussion. But basically, I will go back to the struggle between Vietnam and the South Vietnamese army, between the South Vietnamese army, the ARV, and the RVN versus the communist trained rebels. Right. Um, just a brief background. When you're writing your essay, I don't encourage you to spend time on the background. Maybe if you want to include a background paragraph, you just write one paragraph because there are no marks for background information. Right. What happened with Vietnam was Vietnam ultimately, after the Geneva Conference, there were some power struggles for Vietnam during the Second World War, where it was a colony for the French. It was later on taken by the Japanese. The North Vietnamese were able to liberate themselves from the Japanese rule. They created their own republic in the north, and the south was later on handed back to France. All those politics, they happened. But after the Geneva Conference, there was now potential of a world crisis emanating from the disputes in Vietnam. And countries went on to settle down at Geneva, and they decided at the Geneva Conference, that is where I'm starting my background. At the Geneva Conference, what was decided? They decided that Vietnam was to be split into two. Vietnam was supposed to be split into two. It was formerly one country, but however, because of the crisis that were there at the Geneva Conference, they opted to split Vietnam into two, and the split was supposed to be the North Vietnam, which was a communist, and then there was the South Vietnam, which was a pro-capitalist. Then the dispute here was the North Vietnamese was a communist, and the government was popular here. The government was led by Ho Chi Minh, and was a popular government. It was addressing the demands of the people. They instituted land reform. They gave people land. And also they improved education. The governance was transparent. And also they were having support of China and USSR. That was the North Vietnam situation under Ho Chi Minh. They were trying by all means to support their own people, to fulfill the demands of their own people, to be a transparent government. And in the South, what was happening? This was a pro-capitalist government. It was led by Ngo Diem. The government was unpopular. There was corruption. There was misgovernance. There was nepotism. No land reform was instituted. No attempt, no attempt to improve education. So we see the situation in the South that life was not easy for the South Vietnamese. They were exposed to misgovernance. Their resources were being made not to benefit them, but to benefit a few who were in leadership. There was no attempt to reform education and no attempt to do any land reform. The peasants were very poor. They did not have access to land. Right. So the problem here was now people in the South, given their situation, they were not happy with their government. They wanted to be united with the North Vietnam government, which was prosperous and which was promising its people the good and which was delivering the good to its own people. That was the struggle. And then there was now, here in the South, also there was the support of USA. Given this situation, people in the South were not happy. That led to the emergence of the rebels. Which were called the Viet Cong, who were supported by the North Vietnamese army. They were not happy with the government. They wanted to fight the government. These rebels who were termed the Viet Cong. That is how the Viet Cong got to emerge. They were having support of the peasants who were not happy with the government. And also they were getting support of North Vietnamese that wanted the whole of Vietnam to be united under communism. That was the threat with Vietnam, South and North. And the other issue, which was also there, when they settled at the Geneva Conference, they decided that there were supposed to be formal elections. After the split of Vietnam, there were supposed to be formal elections where the legitimate leader was supposed to be elected between the leader of the North or the leader of the South. The leader of the North being Ho Chi Minh. He was popular and it was most definite that he was going to win the election. While DM in the South was unpopular because of his corrupt acts. And what did America do? Knowing well that if there was a formal election, a transparent election, there was going to be a landslide victory for the side of the North. And the South Vietnam was going to fall under the control of China and Russia and the communist North. America blocked the elections. The USA, they blocked the elections. For they knew well that once the elections were held and the elections being transparent, they were going to produce a result which was unfavorable to their side and was going to be in favor of the North, and apparently the whole Vietnam was going to be united under communism. So they chose not to fall into that dead trap. They blocked the elections. Right. So we are going into the details of the essay. Right. What was the reason for the involvement of America? Why did America got involved in the war? Involvement of the USA. The USA was following an ideology which was called the domino theory. They were following the domino theory. That was their ideology, or that was the main thinking of Americans, which led them to get involved physically in the politics of Vietnam. They were thinking of what they called the domino theory. We want to look at what kind of thinking it was. Was it realistic and a feasible form of thinking? What they called the domino theory. Right. We were going to look at the domino theory as an illustration according to our guide that we are following. Then we have the domino theory being illustrated in form of a picture. Right. Let's go and see how the domino theory was thought of by the Americans. Right. Why did America get involved? America believed that if one country becomes communist, all other countries will follow suit. Therefore, USA wanted to curb the spread of communism in Vietnam. That was the domino theory. Right. So we are seeing in this illustration, we are seeing the Viet Cong here. The Viet Cong, they are forcing Vietnam to fall into communism. And once if Vietnam was to fall into communism, it was also going to cause Laos to fall into communism. Then the next was going to be Cambodia. The next was going to be Thailand. The next was going to be Burma, India, and lastly, Bangladesh. So America stood not for those countries to fall to communism, because they will fall like dominoes. One will fall on the other one will fall on the other, until the rest of Southeast Asia was going to fall to communism. That was their way of thinking. So they were fighting in as much as was possible to avoid any incidents of victory of communism in Southeast Asia. Right, that was the domino theory. Right. Then, if you also look at the triggering effect, when we are discussing about the war in America, there was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, or the incident of the Gulf of Tonkin. That was the triggering effect of the war. Right, what happened with the Gulf of Tonkin? August 1964, U.S. patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin claimed to have been fired upon. The Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They gave the president the power to take all necessary measures to prevent further aggression or armed attacks against U.S. forces. Right, America had got its patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin region, and they claimed that amongst their patrol members, some of them were attacked, and their patrol ships were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. And they used it as an excuse to start a physical fight, because they settled down and did what was called the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They were coming now with a solution to the claimed attack. They were now saying, we are under threat. These communists, they want to attack us. And they have showed us that they have potential of attacking us from the Gulf of Tonkin. And they gave the president special powers to declare any form of attack on Americans would mean that the Americans would also attack against their attack to prevent their interests. And then they were now triggering aggression against each other. It is historically believed that the attack was non-existent. It was just a way of finding a resolution to start a conflict which was physical. That was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Then, on the other effect, besides following the ideology of the domino theory, the Americans, why did they get involved? Americans said it was wanted to save the South Vietnamese people from the evils of communism. For the North was under control of communism, they also felt if North extends its influence, it was going to influence the people of the South, and hence communism was going to become the order of the day, even for people in the South Vietnam. So they were claiming that communism was evil, and people were supposed to be saved from the evils of communism, which was based on the ideology of tensions of communism and capitalism back in Europe. And also, Americans wanted to contain the containment theory to stop the spread of communism in the world, which was based upon the Truman Doctrine, where Harry Truman was giving support to countries under threat of communism, military support and financial support to defend themselves against Russian invasion. That was the Truman Doctrine by Harry Truman, where he was offering financial and military support to countries which were prone to attack by communism, so that they would strengthen their armies and be able to resist Russian and other communist invasion. And then the USA wanted to support non-communist governments which were threatened by communists. It knew that the USSR and China, both communist ruled, were sending aid to communist North Vietnam. Right, so they were also fearing that the North Vietnam was a threat in the region because they were getting support from USSR and China. So they felt like they were supposed to defend and protect other countries in Southeast Asia from any attack from North Vietnam. For North Vietnam was getting military support and also financial support, and was a threat to other countries in Southeast Asia. Right, this one here is just a summary of some of the US strategies. It forced North Vietnam to give up war, make North Vietnam agree to settlement acceptable to US, protect South Vietnam, and win support of South Vietnamese. Right, we're going to look at those strategies in detail. Right. We are now going into the struggle, the real struggle between the North Vietnamese and the USA. Right. The Tet Offensive as a turning point. I think we are going to look at it. Let's start by looking at what were the Viet Cong tactics. Right, the Viet Cong, what tactics did they use in the war against the US, which made them win that particular war? We're going to clarify these forms of fighting. The USA versus the Viet Cong. When we're looking at war tactics, we have what we call conventional and what we call non-conventional methods of fighting. Right, so if you are looking on the side, at the side of the USA, America was employing conventional tactics or conventional military strategies. Conventional, we are saying, those are known methods of fighting. The conventional methods which are in the book, which are known, using a regular army, using regular tactics and strategies, which are known. That is conventional warfare. But however, for the guerrillas, for the South Vietnamese, who were the Viet Cong, they were using non-conventional methods of fighting. Their methods were unknown. They did not have any regular armies, and they did not use any regular weapons in the war. They were just improvising and using whatever was available for them and used whatever was available to their disposal. And actually, it worked for them. And they were able to prosper in that war against the mighty Americans. So I want to just make a summary of some of the tactics that were used by the Vietnamese and also the tactics and strategies that were used by the USA, so that we see which one outweighed the other and how did it get to realize positive results of the end of the war by the Vietnamese guerrillas against the mighty Americans. Right. So if you are looking on the side of, let's start with the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. I'll just summarize, then I'll explain some of the tactics. The Viet Cong, they were using non-conventional methods in the war. Right. I'll make a list of some of the non-conventional tactics that were used by the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong, basically, they used guerrilla warfare. Right. They used hit and run tactics. They used advantage of the camouflage. They took advantage of not wearing uniforms. They used landmines. And also the booby traps. And also the Vietnamese, they were they were benefiting from support from peasants. And they were also benefiting from support from North Vietnam, which was backed by Russia and China. They also benefited from the landscape, knowing their landscape. And also, these Vietnamese, they made use of tunnels in the war. And also, the Vietnamese, they benefited later on. They changed their tactics. They used the Tet Offensive. Right, so if we were to look at these tactics here, these are some of the non-conventional tactics that were used by the Viet Cong. And these tactics were very effective to the extent that they ended up winning the war against the mighty Americans. So what was it with the tactics that made them succeed? The guerrilla warfare. Right, when we're talking of the guerrilla warfare here, we are saying they were avoiding face-to-face fight. They avoided at all costs to face the Americans. They would attack from unknown angles and would disappear. They were avoiding face-to-face to steer a face-to-face fight with the Americans. And they were fighting in small groups. What was the advantage of fighting in small groups? If there's a casualty or if there's an instance of successful shooting from your enemy, maybe they will only kill 3 or 4 of you, not the whole group. If you are fighting as a group of 300 and you are massacred, is to your disadvantage, unlike fighting in smaller groups. So they were just fighting in small groups, such that even if the Americans would try to use the conventional methods upon them, they would not even be able to massacre them because they will be just in small numbers. And then the hit and run tactics. Hit and run, they will attack also from unknown angles. Attack as fast as was possible the moment they establish their enemy, and they will disappear. How did it impact on the Americans? The American soldiers, they ended up being very scared and confused in the war. Americans became very scared because they never knew where their enemy was coming from and when the enemy was going to attack. They would just find themselves under attack. And before they even realized the enemy is gone. So it was to the advantage of the Viet Cong that they were using those tactics so that they would attack as quick as is possible before the enemy realizes and they would disappear. That instilled fear amongst the American soldiers, for they didn't even know when the enemy was going to attack and from where the enemy was coming from. And even they didn't even realize who their enemy was because they would attack and disappear. Then you talk of camouflaging. They were blending with the environment. They were blending so well with the environment, the Vietnamese. They were able to blend well with the environment, with the thickets, in the forests, such that it was to their advantage that the American soldiers could not easily identify them because they would match well with the surroundings. They would match well with the forest. They would match well with the surrounding of the whole environment, and actually to their advantage to attack the enemy unseen and disappear into the environment again without the enemy realizing. Then also not wearing uniform, it confused Americans. USA soldiers, they didn't know who the enemy was. If your enemy is in uniform, you can easily identify. But if they were not in uniform, it meant that the Americans could not even realize who the guerrillas were because they were not in formal uniform. They were just fighting in plain clothes. And that was to the disadvantage of Americans, for they didn't even know who the enemy was. You would treat your enemy as an ordinary civilian at some point in time. They attack you. And then you attack your civilian in the pretext of your enemy. Again, you are criticized by atrocities, by killing innocent people in the war. So Americans were also very confused for fighting with people who did not have distinct war uniform or war regalia. Then also the landmines, they were planting landmines. American soldiers would see themselves under the trap of the booby traps and also the landmines. They would step on the landmines and they would burst, and that led to so many deaths amongst the American soldiers. They didn't even know where the landmines were planted, for they were not familiar with the environment and the surroundings. Also, the booby traps. They wouldn't even know that they were going through a trap, and ultimately they would find themselves getting trapped and apparently dying in the trap. So American soldiers became very scared in the war. They could rarely walk around freely because they wouldn't know where the landmines were and also where the traps were. So they were very scared and confining themselves and not even be able to move around, for they risk themselves getting to step on the landmines or getting to be trapped in the booby trap. And also the support of peasants. The peasants were promised land by the Vietnamese. They promised them land and also they assisted them in daily activities like farming. So the peasants were very happy. They were promised that once we conquer these Americans, we are going to unite with the North. And we are also going to benefit the same as what the North are benefiting. They are having land. They are having a good government. Their education has improved. So we are fighting for the liberty of the general citizen so that we are united with the North. We are not fighting an ideology war, but we are fighting a war to get ourselves united as one nation, as what we used to be in the old Vietnam as a state. So the peasants were very happy. They would support the guerrillas. They would give them all the basics of the war. They would give them food. They would accommodate them. And hence, it was to the advantage of the guerrillas. They would have enough food supplies. And they would flourish and be able to fight against the Americans. Then also the support from North Vietnam and Russia and China. Here we are looking at specifically the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Americans, they bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail in an attempt to do away with the smuggling of weapons into South Vietnam from North Vietnam. But however, Russia and China, they replaced everything. And also, the damage which was done by Americans to try and sabotage the guerrillas, they were also they were instantly assisted by Russia and China so that they would come back to their feet and be able to proceed with the war. Right. So that was great support. They were also receiving arms from Russia and China through the North Vietnam. Then their landscape, the guerrillas knew their landscape well. It was their country of origin. They knew how the landscape looked like. They knew how to benefit from the landscapes, while the Americans didn't know anything. Then also the tunnels, they dug tunnels as long as 250 kilometers as a way of finding a hiding place from the enemy's attack. And those kitchens, they were also very equally important, for they had clinics to attend the injured, and also they had food stores, they had kitchens to feed in the tunnels. And also we talk of the armory supplies in the tunnels. So it was beneficial for the Viet Cong. They would go and feed within the tunnels, come out fit for fighting. If they are injured, they would go to the tunnels, get attended to. And also the armories, they would also get more weapons from the armory supplies within the tunnels. So it was to the advantage of fighting in that way. And also, before we look at the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong were also involved in sabotage. They would sabotage and damage critical infrastructure for the Americans so that they were not able to effectively communicate and effectively transport each other throughout the battle. So they would do sabotage by sabotaging infrastructure, critical infrastructure like the roads. Them, the guerrillas, they were not relying much on the infrastructure. They were relying on physical fight based on their physical abilities, not based on the infrastructure and modern forms of transportation. They were not fighting a conventional war. So they would do sabotage, like on infrastructure, they would destroy infrastructure so that the Americans would not find an effective way of communicating and transporting one and each other from one point to the other. Then we go on to Tet Offensive. Tet Offensive, they now chose to change a fighting method. Now they were now doing surprise attack. Surprise attacks on US-controlled towns and cities. They did this immediately after the holiday period. That was after the December period. It was in January when people were not prepared for war. The guerrillas, they did surprise attacks on American-controlled cities in the south. And apparently they won the control of part of Saigon, which was the capital city. That signaled potential of the Viet Cong winning a war. If you manage to take part of the capital city, it was a signal that victory was certain for them. They took part of Saigon after the Tet Offensive. Right. Then we go to the American strategies. I'm going to summarize them and just make an explanation. Right. The USA, they were using conventional methods of fighting or tactics. Right. They send military advisors. Right. And also what they did, they also tried, they sent about 500,000 ground troops. And also, they instituted Rolling Thunder. Then they also instituted chemical warfare. And here, specifically, they were using napalm. Right? They also introduced what was called Operation Ranchend. And then there was also Search and Destroy. And this led to the My Lai massacre. They also instituted, the Americans, they did quite a lot, though we might not exhaust some of the things. We're going to look at them as we go through our discussion guide. This is just my own guide. We are going to compare the information with what is on our guide. right? And also on Americans, we can also talk of them instituting or using young and inexperienced soldiers in the war. And also can talk of the Americans getting now to Vietnamize. These are some of the things that you can talk about as we look at the side of the Americans. But in construction of your paragraphs in the writing of the essay, when you are linking your statements, make sure that you link in a way that shows that though these ways were conventional, they were ineffective. Though this method had got potential of making America win the war, but they had some weaknesses in them, which made them not effective enough to make the Americans win the war. Apparently, the Americans lost the war because of their tactics, which were not effective enough. Military advisors, we can talk of Americans sending military advisors to the Vietnamese to prepare them for the war and to get them ready for fighting. They wanted to prepare the South Vietnam Army for the war through sending advisors who were going to give the military advice on how to sail through the war. Then also sending ground troops. They sent 500,000 ground troops to Vietnam. Was it an effective way? It was not effective because those guys, though they were sent there, they were faced with so many challenges, like not knowing the terrain, fighting with people whom they didn't even know, and also being unable to track their enemies. Rolling Thunder, this was a mass bombing technique. Mass bombing in the sense that it is argued, according to history, that the total number of bombs that were thrown during the Second World War were even less than the bombs that were thrown in Operation Rolling Thunder. It was a mass bombing campaign. And what was their target? They were targeting that they were supposed to destroy industrial sites for the Viet Cong and also the military bases. They wanted to weaken resistance from the guerrillas. But however, they didn't know that the guerrillas were not fighting a formal war. They did not even have military bases to settle and strategize from. They were just fighting from the woods. They were also targeting industrial targets to weaken production of goods in South Vietnam so that the guerrillas would not have enough supplies. But however, it was not also effective because mainly South Vietnam was a farming country. It was a country of peasants. So they missed their targets and the Rolling Thunder was ineffective. Then we talk of chemical warfare. They were using napalm, which was a burning substance which would stick to the human body and would burn the human body to death. Ultimately, this fighting strategy was criticized for atrocities. It was a cruel method of fighting to burn a human being alive until death in a war. And that chemical would stick to the human body. Right, and also Operation Range Hand, there was usage of Agent Orange, and also there was usage of Agent Blue. The difficulty with Americans was that of finding the enemy. So they used chemicals to destroy the forests so that they would be able to identify their enemies. They chose to use Agent Orange to destroy so that they would find their enemies, and also used Agent Blue to deprive the guerrillas of food. It would damage, it was a herbicide that would damage the food crops and also would make the soil infertile so that the guerrillas would be deprived of food. But however, it was also known to cause cancers amongst the soldiers, even the American soldiers. They were affected by those chemicals. They had incidents of cancers. And also, it was also criticized by environmentalists. They were damaging the environment. They destroyed thousands of hectares of forests, which was against environmental laws. And apparently, they had to withdraw the tactics because of environmental concerns. Then the search and destroy, again, their main problem of the Americans was identifying their enemies because their enemies were farmers during the day and were guerrillas at night. So they wanted to find an effective way of identifying who their enemy was. That is why they had to institute the search and destroy. They would try to search for the enemy and destroy the enemy as what the operation suggested. But however, it was failing. Still, they could not identify who their enemy was. And at the end, they ended up getting involved in what was called the My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre, they were told that they found a village which was called My Lai on their maps, and they went to that particular village. They were misinformed that it was a guerrilla military base. And they went there with the intention of destroying whoever they were going to find in that particular village. For they were fully informed that that was the base for the Viet Cong. But that was misinformation. They went there, they did acts of great atrocities, they raped women, they killed, massacred all the people in that village, only to find that it was predominantly women and children and the elderly. The guerrillas were not even there. Amongst those who were killed, it was only identified that maybe there were only 3 or so guerrillas amongst the whole population massacred in the whole village of about more than 300 people. And that, remember, it was the first televised war. The whole world went amok upon receiving the news that Americans had massacred innocent people in a particular village, and there was uprising across the world. Mainly in America, people started to protest against the government's involvement in Vietnam and also to protest against the killing of innocent civilians in the war. That also made Americans lose their confidence in the war, and also it embarrassed them. And apparently, they were losing confidence in their ground in the war. Then you can also talk of Americans sending young and inexperienced soldiers into the war. These young soldiers, they thought that the war was a walk-through war. For they were fighting a small nation, they just felt that they would even send the young soldiers, they would still win, for they were going to fight with a weaker nation. But that was not the reality. These young soldiers were massacred by the Viet Cong guerrillas. Most of them, they died in the war, and they lost the confidence in the war. They were just there to stand for America, but without any confidence, and they were massacred, the majority of them, leading to protests again in America. Americans were now protesting against the America's involvement. One, for budgetary constraints. It was very expensive to run that war, and also two, for the loss of lives. So many soldiers were sent to Vietnam and lost their lives there. So Americans were no longer happy with the involvement of America in the Vietnam politics. And there were so much protests in America, and that ultimately forced America to change its mindset in the involvement of Vietnam politics. Right, then there was also villagization, or what was called the strategic hamlet policy. This was a policy by the Americans to separate guerrillas from civilians. They wanted to be sure of who the guerrillas were. So they created new villages whereby they were taking the peasants into those villages. And they were trying to make sure that whoever was not in the village was deemed to be a guerrilla, because the guerrillas were always hiding. So they took all the civilians into the new villages, and they wanted to make sure that there was a separation between the guerrillas and the villages. But however, it failed. How did it fail? The guerrillas operated in the villages also. The moment they will go and take people to the villages during the day, they will also be taking the guerrillas into the villages, because they were guerrillas during the night, and during the day, they will be farmers. So they could not actually see who the guerrilla was, because during the day, they will go around doing their normal farming business. At night, they will assemble and go to fight against the Americans. So it was actually difficult for the Americans to split the ordinary civilians from the guerrillas, for the guerrillas were also farmers during the day and would fight at night. So ultimately, the police failed drastically, and the Americans could not even identify who the guerrilla was and who the a villager was. So it failed. And also the villagers who were taken to the new villages, they were not happy for them to be forced to live out of their ancestral land. They had been on their ancestral land doing their farming. Then now there's a new policy which is driving them away from their ancestral lands. They were also not happy, such that they ended up giving more support to the guerrillas, and also giving more protection to the guerrillas so that they would keep on fighting. They were now no longer interested in any of the American things and ideas. They were now only interested in their unity with North Vietnam, which was at liberty. Right, then lastly, we talk of Vietnamization. That was when the Americans chose to withdraw gradually from the Vietnam War. They left the South Vietnam War gradually to fight their own war. The South Vietnam was left to fight their own war. The Americans withdrew gradually from the war. That was apparently the Vietnamization. And that led to the complete withdrawal of America from the war. And apparently, South Vietnam was united with North Vietnam under the control of communism. So these are some of the tactics that were used by the Viet Cong, like what we've been discussing earlier on. The ARVN units, we talked about not wearing uniform, we talked of ambushes, we talked of avoiding face-to-face, digging tunnels. This is part of the tactics that were used by the Viet Cong. And after that, we talk of the Tet Offensive, which was instituted by the guerrillas as part of their tactics to make surprise attacks and control the cities which were controlled by the USA in South Vietnam. And apparently they managed to seize part of Saigon, which was the capital of the South, through Tet Offensive. Right. Then we move on. The Viet Cong tactics, we are also going on a summary of them. They were helped by local people, and also the use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We've talked about that. The peasants, we also talked about the peasants. They had an influence on the South Vietnamese guerrillas. And also, they carried out sabotage, usually the bombs. They were bombing the bases, they were bombing US bases, they were bombing infrastructure as sabotage. That was also part of the tactics used by the Viet Cong. Right, then the Americans, what did they use? They used Agent Orange, they used napalm. It was part of Operation Rolling Thunder, right? They also tried to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail to avoid supplies to the south, winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese, though it didn't work well. Then the My Lai incidents, which was part of the search and destroy, it explains how the My Lai massacre went on and apparently how they ended up massacring innocent people. It says on the 16th of March 1968, 9 helicopters gunship landed 3 US platoons near the village of My Lai. The US troops were on a search and destroy mission, and Lai Mai was believed to be a Viet Cong stronghold. Over a 2-hour period, the Americans killed hundreds of men, women, and children, probably 300, but maybe more. The truth about the massacre did not come out for 18 months. Only Lieutenant Kali was convicted of war crimes. He only served 3 years of his life sentence. Right. You can see, as indicated here, the My Lai incidents, which was a brutal attack on innocent people in the village. You can see amongst the people, this looks to be a very orderly, innocent civilian. And the rest, you can see these are young. They cannot be guerrillas by the look of their ages. And they were strongly brutalized and apparently killed in the process. And these people were innocent. They were not even part of the guerrillas. But because of the misinformation that the American army received, they ended up brutalizing those people and ended up killing them. Right. It explains pictures of the massacre. Americans refused to believe the story. Right. And then Vietnamization. We are looking at the transition of leadership of America from the leadership of Johnson until the time when Nixon came into power. When Nixon came into power, he introduced Vietnamization, for the war had become so expensive, and also protests at home were also a daily issue for the Americans. So the only way to do away with such protests and also the expense of the war was apparently for America to Vietnamize and withdraw from Vietnam. Right. That was the Vietnamization process. The ARVN, this was a South Vietnam War army. They were supposed to stand on their own after the Vietnamization. Right. And how did the war come to an end? That was basically how the war came to an end. North Vietnam invaded South by July 1976. Vietnam was one country again, which was ruled by communists. The ARVN was not strong enough without American support. So at the end, the North Vietnam was able to conquer and apparently get South Vietnam united under the control of communists. So apparently we can say the Americans, in conclusion, they failed to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia because the Vietnam that they were fighting for, they lost the war, they withdrew from the war, and apparently South Vietnam got to unite with North Vietnam as a communist country. Right. What was the impact of the war on Vietnam? Many villages and communities were destroyed during the fighting. Civilians suffered brutal treatment, including torture and rape. 2 million Vietnamese are thought to have died during the conflict. The war left hundreds and thousands of orphans and wounded civilians. Right, that was the impact on the Vietnamese. They were innocent. They were not even interested in the politics of capitalism and communism. But at the end, they were affected negatively by the involvement of America in their country and the apparent results of the war. What was the impact of the war on Vietnam? Right, economic effects were devastating. They lost their way of life. Remember, they were peasants. The Americans were spraying herbicides on their crops. They destroyed the fertility of their land. At the end, they could not make a living and feed their people. They were negatively impacted. Their environment also was damaged. We talked of the chemicals that were used and were sprayed in the forest to destroy the forest so that they could identify their enemy. But however, that was an environmental concern, and they damaged the environment. And also, we can talk of unexploded bombs. The bombs that were planted, which are exploded, they ended up having ripple effects on the way of life of people. People could not move freely, for they would step on those unexploded bombs that were set as traps by either side during the war. So at the end, everything was disturbed. The way of life was disturbed. And also because of the chemicals used in the war, they had got ripple effects whereby they would cause cancers for the coming time periods, and also producing people producing babies with deformities because of those chemicals that were used in the war. Right. What was the impact on the Americans? There was anti-Vietnam War protests in Ohio State University, and also there were some killings that were happening at Kent University. As you can see in the illustration there, Americans were frustrated by the involvement of America in the world politics, and they were protesting against their government's involvement in the world politics and in world affairs, which were costly to them and also which were making them lose some of their loved ones in those wars. So they were protesting, and apparently the government was trying to stop the rebellion against the people protesting from against the government's involvement in the world politics. And apparently that led to killings around America, and also there was civil unrest in America. Right. The Vietnamization, we had talked about that when President Nixon decided to withdraw from Vietnam. And apparently there was that issue of the Vietnam getting united. So it says 1969, Nixon's doctrine stated that U.S. would help those who helped themselves. Vietnamization phase of war began. 27 January 1973, ceasefire agreed withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Vietnam. They withdrew their troops back to America, and civil war continued until March 1975, when North Vietnam took control of Saigon, renamed it to Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam was reunited. So it ended up being a civil war between the North Vietnamese army and with the support of the guerrillas, and also against the ARVN, which were the South Vietnamese army. And without American support, the ARVN could not stand its ground to fight against North Vietnam and the guerrillas. And at the end, the civil war did not last for long. And apparently, their capital, which was Saigon, which had partly been taken by the guerrillas, was fully taken control of by the North Vietnamese army. And apparently, they renamed it to their leader of the North, Ho Chi Minh, and that signaled the loss of South Vietnamese AVRN army. And apparently, it was united under the rule of communists, which were the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh. And if you are looking at the perspective of the war from the Vietnamese were not fighting an ideology war. It was not an ideological war to their side. They were not interested in the politics of capitalism and communism. What they were only wanting, they were wanting to unite themselves as one nation. It was a nationalist war to them. They were fighting for their identity. They were fighting for their country. They had love for their own country. They wanted to be united as one country. That was their ideology of fighting in the war. And for the Americans, it was mainly based on the ideologies of capitalism and communism. America was fighting a containment war. They were following the doctrine of Truman. And also they were adopting the domino theory, which was based on Asia. They were feeling like they were going to lose the ground if countries were starting to follow communism. Their economic system was going to be weakened by countries adopting communism. So the perspective of the war was different from the side of the Vietnamese and from the side of the Americans. The Americans were fighting an ideological war, and the Vietnamese were fighting a nationalistic war. So when you are coming to a conclusion of the essay, you have discussed on the various techniques and you link them to the fact that despite the mighty military of the US, they failed to defeat a small nation. When you're looking at America, you focus on this tactic, you point out the strategy, you explain how it was implemented and what it targeted to achieve, and you give examples of whatever, and you link it back to the question to show how it failed or how it made Americans weaker in the war and apparently losing the war. You focus on Vietnamese strategies, you highlight a point, you explain the point, you give relevant examples or relevant evidence, and you show the strength of the tactic and apparently how it made Americans lose the war. That is how you link as you go through your paragraphs. And then when you come to a conclusion, we know you are summing up the key points and you do not introduce anything new in the conclusion. You just tie up your points, you highlight or you emphasize on what you think maybe is key in the discussion, and you tie up your conclusion with a relevant piece of writing which sums up all what you have been discussing in the essay. So basically, that's the content requirement for the essay. The essay might come in a different format. It can come in a to what extent. It can come as a critical discussion or this one of do you agree. Those are the three formats of the essay settings. But however, you should apply the same information of the strategies that were used in the war, but however, they should address the question when you are linking until you get to your conclusion. Then that will give you the best mark. If you have highlighted on those strategies, I think you can see, you can highlight as many strategies as is possible so that you cover enough content for the essay. And also mind your presentation. Make sure you address the requirements of the essay and you address the Peel method of paragraph writing, and then you tie up your conclusion in the relevant way, such that your essay has got proper presentation and has got sufficient content coverage. 3 pages is just a minimum. An ordinary learner in the examination can write up to 6 pages because those points, you should keep them in your mind. And you must be able to elaborate on them to create paragraphs. Memorizing the point is not even difficult. You can have as many strategies as 15 of them. And what now becomes a problem is for you to be able to explain them to create paragraphs, but which is also not difficult. The more you practice, the more perfect you become. Such that by the time you get to junior examinations, you are perfect. The time you get to your preliminary examinations, you are perfect. And the time you get to your final examinations, you are more than perfect. The only issue here is with practice and also with history. You are blessed. You know your content is the same. You are tested on the same question when you are writing your first term tests. And again, you will be tested on the same content when you are writing your your junior examinations. When you are writing your prelim examinations, you are again tested on the same content. When you're writing your final examinations, you are still tested, which means the more you practice a particular essay question, the more you get to perfect yourself in that essay, and the more you get to memorize the content at your fingertips, at the disposal of your fingertips, and that will be to your disadvantage, to your advantage, rather, at the end of your course. And there's nothing that will limit one from getting a distinction in history. Specifically, if you are one who prefers essay writing, I advise you to write 2 essays in the examination and 1 source-based question. Then it will be balanced like that. You get your clear distinction, crystal clear. Thank you. That brings us to the end of our discussion. I hope the discussion is going to take you all along to assist you in preparing for your examinations and whatever form of task you are going to do as you go through your course of study in history. As usual, your host is going to